Robert Leslie Roberson III, born on November 10, 1966, is on death row for the 2002 murder of his 2-year-old daughter. At the time, Roberson had custody of the child and was accused of violently assaulting her and fatally shaking her. In 2003, he was put on trial, found guilty of capital murder, and sentenced to death. Since then, all of his appeals have been denied. His execution, which was originally scheduled for October 17, 2024, has been rescheduled to October 16, 2025. The case against Roberson was primarily built on findings of blunt force trauma. However, during the trial, prosecutors also argued that he had shaken his daughter so violently that it contributed to her death, presenting this theory under the widely debated and controversial framework of shaken baby syndrome. Critics have since called the reliance on this theory junk science, sparking significant controversy around the legitimacy of Roberson's conviction. Roberson's defense attorneys countered the state's case by arguing that the child had actually been suffering from pneumonia, which had advanced into sepsis by the time of her death. They attempted to challenge the conviction under Texas' so-called junk science law, which allows appeals in cases where questionable or discredited scientific testimony may have influenced the outcome. Those efforts, however, were unsuccessful. Even aside from the shaken baby syndrome testimony, prosecutors pointed to evidence that the girl had sustained multiple severe injuries consistent with long-term abuse, any of which could have been fatal. The legal battle extended into unusual territory when the Texas Supreme Court temporarily upheld an injunction so that Roberson could provide testimony before the Texas House Committee on Criminal Jurisprudence. But the court later clarified that legislative committees do not have the authority to issue subpoenas with the goal of interfering in scheduled executions, since execution dates are judicial orders. After this ruling, a new execution date was requested. In the end, Roberson himself never testified before the committee, though others did, including one of his attorneys and even a juror from his trial, who came forward to speak in support of Roberson. According to official records, between 1991 and 1999, Robert Leslie Roberson accumulated a criminal history that included convictions for burglary, theft, and multiple parole violations. He ultimately regained his freedom in the year 2000 after completing these sentences. By the early 2000s, Roberson's personal life was already marked by instability. He had gone through a divorce and was the father of 2 children from that marriage. In addition, he had fathered another daughter with a different woman who was described as a habitual drug user and sex worker. This child, Nikki Michelle Curtis, was born on October 20, 1999. Following her birth, Nikki was placed in the care of her maternal grandparents. Later, after DNA testing confirmed Roberson's paternity, he was granted custody of her. Reports indicate that Nikki suffered from a number of chronic health issues almost immediately after her birth. On January 31, 2002, just 2 years after completing his latest prison sentence, Robert Roberson rushed his 2-year-old daughter Nikki to the hospital with severe injuries. He told medical staff that Nikki had fallen from her bed during the night, and when he awoke, he found her unconscious, not breathing, and with apparent head trauma. Despite doctors' efforts to save her, Nikki Curtis was pronounced dead after resuscitation attempts failed. From the outset, the medical team doubted Roberson's version of events. The nature and severity of Nikki's injuries did not align with what one would expect from a simple fall. Several doctors and investigators also noted that Roberson's demeanor and behavior at the hospital seemed strange under the circumstances, fueling their suspicions of abuse. This led to the involvement of law enforcement, and the day after Nikki's death, Roberson was arrested and charged with murder. Under Texas law, the charge carried the possibility of life imprisonment or the death penalty. At trial, prosecutors argued that Roberson had deliberately inflicted fatal head injuries on his daughter through violent abuse. Medical experts testified that Nikki's death was consistent with what was commonly described at the time as shaken baby syndrome, a diagnosis suggesting that forceful shaking caused catastrophic brain injuries. Roberson, however, steadfastly denied causing the fatal injuries. The prosecution bolstered its case with testimony about Roberson's history of violence. Witnesses recalled incidents where he allegedly abused his former wife and his older children. His ex-wife herself testified that Roberson had choked and punched her while she was pregnant. The defense countered that she was an unreliable witness, pointing out that she had lost custody of their children years earlier after a contentious legal battle, and might have had a motive to testify against him. They also highlighted the fact that she had been flown in from Alabama specifically to appear in court. In addition to his ex-wife, multiple individuals connected to Roberson's girlfriend at the time, Teddy Cox, testified against him. They claimed to have seen Roberson shake Nikki on different occasions, yet the defense challenged their credibility as well, emphasizing that Cox had admitted she frequently changed her story depending on her mood, while her children, aged just 9 and 10, might have been influenced by their mother, who had already told them that Roberson was responsible for Nikki's death. Prosecutors maintained that Nikki's death resulted from what physicians described as massive head trauma. During the trial, they pointed to the autopsy findings, which revealed a long list of injuries. According to their account, Nikki's body showed a bruise on the back of her shoulder, a scraped elbow, a mark above her right eyebrow, bruises on her chin and left cheek, and an abrasion near her left eye. In addition, she had multiple bruises on the back of her head, a torn frenulum inside her mouth, bruising on the inside of her lower lip, subscapular and subgaleal hemorrhaging beneath the skin and scalp, bleeding in the subarachnoid space, a subdural hematoma, both pre-retinal and retinal hemorrhages, as well as swelling of the brain. The Innocence Project later challenged the way this evidence had been presented by the state, specifically in briefs filed by the Attorney General's office under Ken Paxton. Their appeals argued that many of the injuries highlighted by the prosecution were not actually present when Nikki was first brought to the hospital. Instead, they claimed these injuries developed as a result of the intensive medical procedures performed in an effort to save her life. Nikki underwent repeated intubation and had a pressure monitor surgically affixed to the top of her skull, interventions that could explain the bruising and internal bleeding cited at trial. Supporters pointed to photographs taken by a nurse along with CT scans as proof of this, though they alleged that these records were kept hidden for years in the courthouse basement. None of this information, they argued, was ever presented to Roberson's jury. Instead, jurors were told that the area where the hospital had placed the pressure monitor was an impact site from an external blow. Furthermore, only one medical professional, the examiner who conducted the autopsy the day after Nikki was removed from life support, testified that the child had suffered multiple blows to the head. The examiner, however, did not review Nikki's full medical history, which included several recent visits to doctors and hospitals in the days before her collapse, nor did she take into account the effects of Nikki's pre-existing health issues or the invasive medical treatment she received in her final hours. During his trial, Roberson's court-appointed defense attorney took a position that directly contradicted his client's repeated assertions of innocence. Rather than challenging the prosecution's claims, the lawyer conceded that Nikki's condition must have been the result of violent shaking. He presented no defense witnesses, nor did he call upon any medical experts to counter the shaken baby syndrome theory. Instead, his argument was that Roberson, who he portrayed as cognitively impaired, had essentially lost control and shaken his daughter in a moment of frustration because he could not get her to stop crying. The defense strategy stood in stark opposition to Roberson's own account, which he had consistently maintained from the moment he brought Nikki to the hospital through the present day that he had not harmed his daughter. On February 21, 2003, the jury in Anderson County found Roberson guilty of capital murder and he was sentenced to death. Roberson attempted to challenge the verdict, filing an appeal with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. However, that appeal was dismissed on July 22, 2007. He later pursued additional appeals, but both were rejected by the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, first in May 2015 and again in August 2015. In the years that followed, Roberson's case began attracting broader attention, largely because a central pillar of his conviction rested on the controversial diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome. While many in the medical community continued to assert that certain injury patterns are highly suggestive of abuse that may, at least in part, result from violent shaking, critics argue that the theory has been misapplied in courts and label it as junk science. Beyond questioning the validity of this theory, Roberson's defense attorneys insisted that his conviction was flawed because the medical experts who testified at trial had failed to explore other possible explanations for Nikki's death. They pointed out that no serious consideration had been given to the chronic health issues the child had been struggling with prior to her death. As part of the new evidence brought forward, the defense argued that Nikki had been suffering from pneumonia, which had progressed into sepsis, and that this was the true cause of her death rather than trauma to the head. They also noted that the medication administered to Nikki during her hospital treatment was no longer given to children due to the serious risks and complications it posed. Prosecutors, however, rejected these claims, maintaining that the defense's new arguments did not disprove their position. Nikki had died from head injuries that had been deliberately inflicted by her father. They countered that some of the bruising and internal bleeding cited by the defense could be explained not by illness but by emergency medical procedures, such as the repositioning of Nikki's skull during intubation, performed in a desperate attempt to prevent brain death. Another element that fueled the ongoing controversy surrounding Roberson's case was the revelation made after his trial that he had been diagnosed with autism. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder that can affect social interaction and communication, often leading to behavior that may appear unusual to others. According to one former detective, this diagnosis shed new light on Roberson's actions in the aftermath of Nikki's death, behavior that investigators had originally interpreted as suspicious. In hindsight, the detective suggested that Roberson's mannerisms could have been the result of his autism rather than an indicator of guilt. Roberson was initially scheduled for execution on June 21, 2016, after all of his standard appeals had been denied. Yet just 4 days before the execution date, he was granted a stay, and a hearing was ordered to re-evaluate his conviction. The central issue at this hearing was whether the guilty verdict could stand, given that it had been heavily influenced by the now disputed shaken baby syndrome theory. In fact, other defendants whose convictions were also based on shaken baby syndrome had successfully had their cases overturned under Texas junk science law, which specifically addresses questionable forensic evidence. Roberson's evidentiary hearing ultimately concluded on March 19, 2021. However, on January 11, 2023, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that the doubts surrounding Nikki's death and the controversy over the shaken baby diagnosis were not sufficient to overturn Roberson's conviction or remove him from death row. The following year, the U.S. Supreme Court likewise rejected an additional appeal from Roberson, leaving his death sentence in place. On July 1, 2024, the trial court in Anderson County issued a death warrant for Roberson, setting his execution date for October 17, 2024. This made Roberson the first death row inmate in the U.S. to face an execution date based specifically on a conviction tied to the shaken baby syndrome theory. News of the scheduled execution reignited fierce debate over his case. Critics questioned whether his murder conviction and death sentence were valid in light of the growing criticism of shaken baby syndrome, while supporters of Roberson pointed to lingering doubts about his guilt. The announcement of his execution date brought these concerns to the forefront once again. In a last effort to avoid execution, Roberson and his defense team filed a series of appeals with the state courts. They argued not only that he was innocent and did not kill Nikki, but also that his undiagnosed autism had played a significant role in preventing him from receiving a fair trial. Despite these claims, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied his appeal on September 11, 2024. Roberson's case drew significant backing from both lawmakers and members of law enforcement who sought to prevent his execution. Among them was Reverend Brian Wharton, a former police officer who had once investigated Roberson and whose testimony had been instrumental in sending him to death row. By this point, however, Wharton publicly urged that Roberson's sentence be commuted, stating that if the investigation had been handled properly, particularly considering Roberson's undiagnosed autism, neither the conviction nor the death sentence would have occurred. Supporters filed a clemency petition with the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, urging that Roberson's death sentence be reduced to life without parole. The petition carried considerable weight. It bore the signature of 84 members of the state's 150-member House of Representatives, best-selling author John Grisham, medical specialists, death penalty defense attorneys, and even former detectives connected to the case. Grisham, one of the most high-profile voices in support of clemency, argued that there was never a crime to begin with and that Texas was preparing to execute an innocent man. Under Texas law, clemency represents the final option available to condemned inmates, with the Board of Pardons and Paroles tasked with making a recommendation and the governor holding the ultimate authority. Yet it was widely acknowledged that Governor Greg Abbott had rarely granted clemency during his administration. In a desperate final effort, Roberson himself wrote directly to the governor just 2 weeks before his scheduled execution, pleading for mercy. On October 8, 2024, Roberson was temporarily granted a new hearing to reconsider his appeal. However, only 3 days later, on October 11, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejected it, leaving his death sentence in place. On October 15, 2024, Administrative Judge Alfonso Charles, who presided over the 10th Administrative Judicial Region, denied Roberson's request to vacate his death warrant. On that same day, the Texas Committee on Criminal Jurisprudence approved a subpoena that would have allowed Roberson to testify before a Texas House committee regarding his case. The following day, October 16, 2024, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted unanimously 6-0 against recommending that Roberson's death sentence be commuted or that his execution be postponed. Under Texas law, the governor can only grant a pardon if the parole board recommends it. The sole remaining option to prevent Roberson's execution would have been for Governor Abbott to grant a 30-day reprieve to allow further litigation, but he showed no indication of doing so. Roberson's attorneys pressed the governor to issue such a reprieve, seeking additional time to continue their legal fight for his life. At the same time, as a final effort to avoid execution, Roberson appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Texas Attorney General's office countered that Roberson had failed to prove his innocence and emphasized that multiple courts had already upheld the finding that Nikki Curtis's death was inconsistent with a shortfall from a bed or complications from a virus. The Supreme Court ultimately rejected this last appeal just hours before Roberson's planned execution. Roberson was scheduled to be executed by lethal injection at 6 p.m. on October 17 at the Huntsville unit. However, a Travis County judge issued an order temporarily blocking the execution. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals later overturned that stay after prosecutors appealed, ordering the execution to proceed. In a final twist, the Supreme Court of Texas intervened and temporarily halted the execution once more after Roberson's attorney and several state lawmakers filed a last-minute appeal seeking a stay. Roberson had been scheduled to appear before the Texas House Committee on October 21, 2024, where his testimony was intended to inform lawmakers' consideration of potential amendments to state law concerning the use of junk science in criminal trials. However, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton prohibited Roberson from testifying in person, citing security concerns related to transporting a death row inmate to the Capitol. On November 15, 2024, the Texas Supreme Court ruled that state lawmakers had exceeded their power in summoning Roberson to testify before the House committee. While the court clarified that a new execution date could be set, it also affirmed that lawmakers retained the authority to call Roberson to testify, with the responsibility falling on the executive branch to accommodate such a request. Subsequently, on December 2, 2024, Judge Deborah Oaks Evans, who had originally signed Roberson's death warrant, voluntarily recused herself from the case. On June 17, 2025, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton filed a second motion requesting the setting of a new execution date for Roberson, following the transfer of the case's prosecution to his office at the request of District Attorney Allison Mitchell. On July 16, State District Judge Austin Reeve Jackson officially scheduled Roberson's execution for October 16, 2025. On September 26, reports indicated that Roberson had chosen to waive his right to seek clemency. Instead, he decided to devote his remaining efforts toward pursuing a new trial for his murder conviction. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.